clicking, putting your post in here. Any questions about this? Nope? All right, so, okay, I believe it's 12:20. Yep, it's now officially 12:20. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? So, what we're doing today, this is a special class period, as you know. So, Hunter Keegan is a former student of mine. He had me for Psych 470, Advanced Abnormal Psychology, 10 years ago, the fall of 2014, over in the Nursing Sciences building across from Urban Outfitters. I'm sure many of you have had classes there. So he gave a presentation on Sid Barrett. I remember the psychosis of Pink Floyd founder Sid Barrett. And he's going to talk to you today about his lived experience with serious mental illness. And there should be a decent amount of time, maybe, I don't know, 20, 25 minutes at the end for question and answers. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Hunter.
Thanks for the introduction. Hi, how's everyone? Awesome. Again, my name is Hunter. I'm going to be speaking with you for about the next 25 minutes about serious mental illness. This is a big issue in our communities, so that's why I like to come out to universities to speak about this topic. If you have any questions or comments as I'm reviewing this material, please feel free to write them down, and like Dr. Weimer said, we will discuss at the end. So again, if anything comes to mind, I would love to hear your questions, and just as a bribe, we'll be handing out copies of this to anyone who has a question or comment at the end, so keep that in mind. Some people call this type of outreach work that I do mental health advocacy, which is a very broad term. So to be more specific, what that means for the purposes of today's conversation is I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own life with serious mental illness and kind of how that all started. And I don't do this to make myself sound super important or as like a self-help presentation. I'm not going to be trying to like tell you how to live your life. But what I really do want to do is destigmatize heavier conversations around serious topics like mental health. On that note, I'm also here to encourage you to think about your own mental well-being and the mental well-being of your wider communities. I'll tell you a bit more about myself before we go too much further, so I'm not just some strange man talking at you. Again, I'm Hunter Keegan. I was born in 1993, which means I'm 31 years old right now, which is pretty terrifying, but there were times in my life where I didn't think I would make it this far, so I'm very grateful. I'm originally from Arlington, Virginia, which is a city just outside of Washington, D.C., but I now reside in Southern Virginia in a town called Roanoke. I went to school here at Penn State. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology that I earned back in December of 2014. Shortly after I graduated from Penn State, I was diagnosed with a serious mental health condition, and that was in early 2015. Remember that I'm speaking from my lived experience. I'm not a licensed clinician. I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, so please don't construe anything that I'm about to tell you as being medical advice. What exactly is serious mental illness, and why do I keep distinguishing it from any mental illness? Remember that per the National Institute of Mental Health, mental illness is actually quite common, with about 1 in 5 adults in the United States being impacted by a diagnosable form of mental health condition each year. But serious mental illness is less common, impacting approximately 1 in 20 people annually. The NIMH defines SMI as a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder resulting in serious functional impairment, which substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. So in other words, these are conditions that can have catastrophic impacts on your life functioning. For example, this might be the type of condition that could land you in a psychiatric hospital. It's the type of condition that may cause you to lose your job if your occupational functioning is too severely impacted. So these are very, very major issues. Examples can include bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, PTSD. Those are just a few examples. And discussing this is critical, that's why I'm here. I know 1 in 20 may not sound like a ton at a glance, but of course, as you all know, this is a nation of over 300 million people, so 1 in 20 out of 300 million is actually quite a few. When left untreated, SMI can have catastrophic, I like to use that word a lot, individual and community impacts. So earlier I used the example of losing your job as one potential outcome of serious mental illness. So let's say you lose your job and you become homeless as a result. Obviously, that is devastating on a personal level, on an individual level. There are wider community impacts too. For example, increased rates of homelessness can increase reliance on public assistance programs, can increase rates of crime in certain areas, can diminish property values, impacting local economies. And I just mentioned that because these are some of the more macro level outcomes you see when we ignore these types of problems. I also need to mention that suicide is a leading cause of death in the United States. I know that's super heavy, but it's something that's currently only being whispered about, and I think that that's a tremendously detrimental thing. The rate of suicide in the United States has increased by approximately 37% in the last 25 years, and it's actually one of the top 3 leading causes of death for young adults. The other leading causes are accidents and homicides. So that's the level of severity that we're talking about here. I know it's very scary, but it's something that needs to stop being whispered about. Despite all of this, there is a stunning lack of education and general knowledge about mental illness amongst the wider public. I know you all are psychology students, so that might sound a little bit outlandish, but keep in mind, there are some even highly educated people who think of psychology and other social science fields as being pseudoscience, and of course that's not the case, as hopefully everyone in this room knows. One example of serious mental illness is bipolar disorder type 1 with psychotic features. And this is what I actually live with. This is what I was diagnosed with shortly after graduating from PSU. I'm going to tell you some of the basics about bipolar disorder type 1. This is a very general overview for people who might need a brief refresher or people who may not have covered this yet in their courses. So remember that bipolar disorder type 1 is characterized by hypomanic and manic mood episodes. Hypomania, remember, means mild mania. It's not going to get so severe that it could land you in a hospital or that it may involve psychotic features, but it can still involve elevated symptoms, for example, more talkativeness. But mania, on the other hand, gets pretty out of control. Mania, for me, remember I speak from my lived experience, begins as racing thoughts, rapid speech, euphoria, grandiosity, feelings of emotional intensity. And over the course of days or weeks, it changes to irritability, anxiety, agitation, and psychosis. Basically, over time, the energy starts feeling more and more strung out. Psychotic features impact some people with bipolar disorder, not everybody, but for people with the psychotic features subtype, we do. Psychosis means you're having a break with reality in the form of delusions and or hallucinations. Remember that not everyone with BP experiences psychosis, and psychosis can occur during manic and or depressive episodes. Lots of people confuse psychosis with psychopathy, which I mentioned because there's a common misconception that psychosis means someone may be acting violently, and that's actually not the case. Psychosis is simply a break with reality. It doesn't mean that you are acting in a violent or immoral manner. Psychopathy refers to a personality trait involving like a lack of empathy and even antisocial, even criminal behavior in some examples. Major depression, of course, is on a general level, can be thought of as the flip side of mania. I want to emphasize that these mood episodes, for a major depressive episode, needs to last nearly every day for 2 weeks or more at a time. I emphasize the length of time that these episodes last for because there's another misconception that bipolar disorder means you're flipping 1 minute to the next, and that is not the case. Additionally, these mood episodes are significantly detrimental to social and or occupational functioning. Remember that we were talking about an ADA-recognized disability, not a matter of having a happy day or sad day or good week or bad week. These can have major impacts on your life functioning in the form of damaging relationships, damaging financial security, even putting you at physical risk. So these are very major outcomes of these types of episodes. All right, so now that we've covered some of the basics about bipolar disorder, I can tell you more about what I call the Great American Bipolar Odyssey. And this is how my journey really began. Back in August of 2014, I was studying here at Penn State University. It was my final semester. I was starting to feel more and more energized after a period of feeling pretty down. You know, I didn't realize it at the time, but I was experiencing symptoms of major depression and hypomania leading into my senior year. I was also partying a lot, and when I say partying, I mean like alcoholism and like hard drug abuse. And that was taking a pretty bad physical and psychological toll on me. But I was thriving in terms of academics. So I was excelling in my classes, and by the end of the semester, I actually graduated early. The issue was that I was starting to become increasingly unhinged around people. People were starting to get kind of thrown off by my behavior because, for example, I'd be speaking very rapidly and very loudly. Again, that's a common symptom of hypomania. After I graduated, the next move I made was back to my parents' place in Northern Virginia. I decided that I wanted to take a road trip from their house down to New Orleans, Louisiana. But as you can see, this road trip went way longer than just New Orleans. What had happened is, as I was driving through the Deep South on the way to New Orleans, I started feeling more and more amped up. My thoughts were scattered and unrelated, but I'd been ruminating on them for hours and hours as I was driving down the highway, and suddenly there was like this key moment where everything kind of like synced up and seemed to form a really, really coherent web of lucid thought that seemed very insightful and unique. So that inspired me to keep driving further from New Orleans to Austin, Texas, and then I got a call from a friend of mine who invited me out to rural Montana. Without thinking about it too much, I decided to drive an additional 1,600 miles from Austin, Texas to Bozeman, Montana. That took me up through the Rocky Mountains in the dead of winter on icy mountain roads, driving recklessly, pulling over at dive bars and just getting hammered every night, running into pretty nefarious people. It was getting really dangerous. I also wanted to mention that around the time I was passing through northwestern Texas and eventually Colorado is when I started experiencing symptoms of psychosis for the first time. I started coming under the impression that I was being observed by government drones, you know, like unmanned aerial vehicles. And I also thought that people who I was running into at gas stations and stuff were like undercover agents kind of tracking my movements. Sounds outlandish, I know, but at the time it felt extremely realistic and extremely disturbing and distressing. Eventually, I made it back to Northern Virginia after about 5 weeks of being on the road. And within a couple of days of being back at my parents' place, my parents could tell something was really off with me. I was becoming really, really agitated and really irritable for like no reason. Kind of just flying off the handle, really amped up, high-strung energy. So my parents kind of strong-armed me into seeing a psychiatrist for the first time as a condition of living with them. And after seeing that psychiatrist for a few appointments, she diagnosed me with bipolar disorder. She told me I was having a manic episode and that she needed to begin prescribing antipsychotic medication and mood stabilizers. I did not want to take psychiatric medication for a variety of reasons, including that I thought it would change my personality. I thought it would cause really bad side effects. I also thought it would interfere with my drinking and drug use, which was still a big component of my life in those days. And I wasn't about to let go of that so easily. I had a number of police interactions starting in April and May of 2015. And the reason for that is because I wasn't taking the medication, my symptoms were basically spiraling out completely unmanaged. And my behavior was getting to the extent where like, I suppose there was a perception that I was a danger to myself. So my psychiatrist, as well as my own family members, began routinely calling cops, like trying to have me detained and taken to a psych hospital. I was able to talk my way out of most of those police interactions until one fateful night, I did make a wrong move with some police, and I was detained, handcuffed, taken to a psychiatric hospital in Northern Virginia, and I was ordered to stay there by a judge for about a week, and that's what's known as a civil commitment. I wanted to mention that the psychiatric hospitalization experience wasn't positive. It wasn't like I walked out being like, oh, I'm so glad I got the help that I needed. It was really, really dark. I don't want to go into a ton of detail about psych hospitalization during this presentation, but maybe during the Q&A we can talk more about it. Just know that there are a lot of ethical concerns with forced hospitalization and forced medical treatment in the United States. After I got out of the hospital, I stopped taking all the meds that they had forced me to take while I was in there. Absolutely did not want to be on medication at that point. And I crashed into this really, really bad, suicidal depression that continued through most of the summer. I was continuing to drink excessively too. I was spending all my time in my parents' basement just getting hammered, watching old movies and trying to shut my brain off. There was a lot of self-medication happening. But it got to a point where maybe in late July of that year, I came to the realization that I really did not want to spend the rest of my life living like that. I was very concerned about what was happening in my life, and I decided to actually start volunteering in my community. It's just an idea that I had that sounded good to me, and I found a mental health clinic near my hometown that was looking for volunteers, and I started volunteering there for about 20 hours a week for the rest of the summer. It was a really great experience because it gave my days a lot more structure. I couldn't just sit around drinking all the time. And it also taught me a lot. I was able to learn from a lot of the clients there. I was also able to learn from the social workers who were staffing the facility. And it turned out that in September 2015, I was able to use that volunteer experience in order to get a full-time paid position with a large social services agency in Virginia. After I started that job for a few months, I realized that it was time for me to stop drinking alcohol. I'm not going to give you some weird motivational speech, but drinking is pretty destructive for most people with bipolar disorder. Substance abuse issues are a very common comorbidity with bipolar, and in my own personal experience, alcohol has been one of the most triggering and detrimental substances that I've ever used. So for me personally, I stay away from the booze. And I got sober for the first time in January 2016. After a couple of months of sobriety and getting back to a healthier baseline, I realized that I was still having a lot of intrusive thoughts and other negative symptoms. So at that point, I decided to seek out a psychiatrist on my own volition, and I started working with them to establish an effective regimen of traditional psychiatric medication. And from that point to this day, I've actually continued taking psych meds. The cocktails have changed quite a few times, but medication continues to be a component of my life. And that is to say that recovering and coping with SMI can be possible. Remember that some SMIs, like bipolar disorder, are chronic, incurable conditions. They can be treated, but there's no cure at this time. Even when taking psych meds, we can still have mood fluctuations though. Because we can have mood fluctuations even when we're on medication, we tend to work with psychiatrists on an ongoing basis for medication management. I also wanted to mention that talk therapy can be very helpful for some people. I am one of those people, and it took me a few tries to find a therapist who I really clicked with and really liked. But once I did, I found that it was really beneficial. It brought a lot more self-actualization to my healing process. And for that reason, I always tell people, if you think you need a therapist and you find someone who you enjoy working with, I would encourage you to stick with them because good therapists can be hard to find. Mental health recovery journeys are usually not linear. I just mentioned that because there will be setbacks along the way most of the time. And you need to remember not to judge yourself or judge others. These are things that can happen, and it is possible to recover from those setbacks in some scenarios. Self-care is the final thing I wanted to mention on this slide. I think in 2024, everybody knows what self-care is, but these are essentially independent strategies that you incorporate into your life to promote your well-being. Things like gardening, journaling, music therapy, socializing with friends. No, these can all be forms of self-care. I wanted to include some mental health resources on here. I think a lot of people don't know about these, so I wanted to mention Psychology Today. That's a really good resource for finding psychiatrists and psychologists or other therapists in your area. There are also educational resources. For example, National Alliance on Mental Illness's website has some good, succinct articles that break down different forms of SMI if you would like to learn more about conditions besides just bipolar disorder. Peer resources are becoming more and more in vogue. I wanted to mention this. Part of what I do involves an online mental health peer support community. That's part of my Bipolar Recorder project. But there are more traditional examples too, like DBSA or Smart Recovery. Peer support groups are basically where people with lived experience come together and share support. So the most traditional example that I think everyone has probably heard of is Alcoholics Anonymous. But again, there's other groups, not just for addiction recovery, but for general mental health support as well. Warm lines are something else that I wanted to mention. These are what used to be known as suicide hotlines. There's now the 988 number, which you can dial for both crisis and non-crisis mental health support. So you may just want to learn more about resources in your area. You can dial 988 and they can help you out with that. Now, this next part sounds a little bit scary, but I believe in informed consent. If you call some of these numbers, they will always claim to be confidential. However, there are ways that your calls can be traced. We don't need to go into detail about it. It's been discussed on my podcast recently, if you would like to check that out. But I did want to let people know that by using E911 and some other technology, it is possible for law enforcement to track your phone. So again, not trying to scare anybody, I just think that if you're going to access these types of resources, you should have full awareness of what you could potentially be getting into. Mental health advocacy, on a positive note, anyone can do it. There's no certification or license required to talk about your own life experiences. And I always encourage people to share their own stories if they're comfortable doing so. Ableist stigma around mental health conditions still permeates American society, but the American Psychiatric Association has actually shown that one of the best ways to reduce this is simply through having conversations like the one we just had today. Remember to look out for yourself and don't be afraid to seek out appropriate resources if you feel you need them. And finally, just as a reminder, you don't have to be mentally ill yourself to be like an ally and advocate for this community. Here are some examples of my own advocacy projects that I wanted to mention. The first is My Brain is Trying to Kill Me. That's my first memoir that I self-published in June of 2020. It is a detailed account of the manic episode that I kind of broadly described to you during this presentation. And it also covers the next few years of my life that followed. That's available on Amazon in Kindle and paperback. And again, I brought free copies for anyone who has a question or comment in a couple of minutes, so keep that in mind. The Bipolar Recorder is my podcast and online mental health peer support community. That project started in October 2021. The podcast began as a detailed series of long-form interviews with people who live with different forms of serious mental illness. Obviously, we primarily cover bipolar disorder, but we also look at other conditions too, like schizoaffective disorder and autism spectrum disorder. We talk about basically all forms of mental illness or mental health condition. I also wanted to quickly mention my musical self-care projects. I sort of moonlight as a musician, and music therapy is really important to me. So some of the projects I work on, I like to release to the universe, and you can find those on Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, etc. Just search my name, Hunter Keegan, and my cool, groovy, psychedelic rock and heavy metal music will come up. All right. Here is my contact information for anyone who would like to reach out. My name is Hunter H. Keegan. My email address is hunterhkeegan@gmail.com. We're on Twitter/X @Bipolar Recorder. That's also where we host our online peer support community that has, I think, like 1,700 members right now, 1,700 followers. So that is our primary social media presence. We're also on Instagram and Mastodon and stuff. We don't have anywhere near as large of a following, and I don't really actively keep an eye on those so much. The official site is bipolarrecorder.com if you would like to learn more formal information about this project. All right, that is everything. I wanted to open the floor for you all at this time. I appreciate you all listening. Does anyone have a question or comment that they would like to open with? And again, I brought books to encourage you. We have a few hands. Let's go here and here.
Okay. So, as someone who involves themselves with the arts in different ways, with like music and stuff. How do you feel that like the media, especially movies and TV shows, have kind of like maybe positive like views of different types of mental health conditions versus like the ones that do a terrible job?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like ones that I would consider not doing a terrible job. I'm trying to think. Okay, one that comes to mind, and this isn't a perfect example, obviously. This is flawed. I don't want people to be like, no, you're wrong. Silver Linings Playbook, in my opinion, has a couple of really good scenes where Bradley Cooper's character is describing delusions during mania. That as I was watching that movie, I was like, oh, this is actually hitting pretty close to home. That is a good, well, it's an acceptable depiction of bipolar mania. If you're looking for a specific scene to check out, there's one where he's talking about having a delusion that his wife was cheating on him, and he like goes to someone's house to confront them about it. That was like pretty hardcore. There is a movie called Unsane, which is a horror movie about a woman who gets involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. It came out a few years ago. It's super disturbing. It was probably the most triggering movie I've ever watched. So if you want to get that kind of vibe of like what it feels like to be in a psych ward, I can't say I would recommend it, but yeah. That's what comes to mind. I'm trying to think of other ones, but to be honest with you, these conditions are just so misunderstood that in order for really there to be an accurate depiction, I think it's the sort of thing that maybe the filmmakers would have to consult with like actual people who live with those conditions. So, thank you for your question, though. That's an awesome question. And we wanted to go here as well.
Just as a quick aside, I think one of the producers for Silver Linings Playbook has a son with bipolar.
That makes a lot of sense.
But my question, you talked about how medication has helped, but it doesn't get rid of fluctuations entirely. But how does it differ with the fluctuations between on medication versus off medication?
Oh, yeah. Wow, that's such a good question. And so keep in mind here, I'm speaking from individual experience because this is obviously going to be way different for everyone. When I was not on medication, my symptoms of psychosis were so much more severe. There was a time where I briefly went off of antipsychotic meds. I was still taking mood stabilizers and stuff. I don't want to go into a ton of detail about my medication, but like basically I stopped taking an antipsychotic for a few months, and during that time I had like rebound psychosis. It was really scary and lasted for like 2 months. I had a delusion that I had been infected by a parasite and that it was like feeding off of my body for like 2 months. It was super fucked up and scary. And I lost a ton of weight during that time. This was like a depression, like psychotic depression. And that is why I continue to take psych meds now. I still take antipsychotics. I found them to be helpful. I find that when I'm on medication, the symptoms can still escalate, but they don't quite get to a level where I'm like imagining shadow people like coming down my chimney and stuff, you know what I mean? So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Here, have the book.
Thank you. So can you talk a little bit more about how your degree in psychology and your background have impacted your journey and also your podcast and what you talk about on there?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that. I think it's really important to have some sort of formal background in social science if you're going to do this type of outreach work. I'm not saying you necessarily need a degree, but I think there's a lot of mental health advocates operating in this space who don't really have like the formal knowledge base to draw from. A lot of people say, oh, a bachelor's degree in social science, liberal arts, what? Yeah, there's a lot you can do with this knowledge base. It might not necessarily be the same as like an engineering degree where you're going to get like one specific type of job, but it's been a kind of like multidisciplinary background to draw from, and what it's been extremely helpful for is being able to actually read and interpret scientific research and be able to like actually understand like what the statistics mean and like what does the abstract say, what is the conclusion. You don't have to get into like the minutia of the methodology and things like that, but just that alone is very helpful for when I'm trying to research material for like a podcast episode or for like this presentation. You know, all the information, all the statistics that I cited were pulled from like CDC, NIMH, APA, and it's useful to know how to navigate those different types of sources. That might be kind of a boring answer, but I think it is important to keep in mind. And definitely as psychology students yourselves, and is anyone graduating soon? Oh, whoa! Whoa, that's so many of you. Okay, congratulations. You will all be uniquely equipped to go out into the world and like talk to people about these issues. And you do have like unique perspective and expertise to bring. So I do hope that you will consider, continuing to think about mental health advocacy and just keeping that in mind as you move forward in your lives.
You mentioned experiencing the psychotic symptoms, and from what I heard, it included both delusions and hallucinations. So I know how the definitions differ, but as someone who experienced both, how would you distinguish them?
Well, remember that delusions are what you're thinking, and then hallucinations are going to be like a false sensory perception, like smelling or tasting something that's not there, or of course seeing or hearing something that's not there. So they're often interrelated, but in some cases people will only experience one or the other during like a particular psychotic episode.
So the parasite example that you gave, would that be like more hallucination?
No, that would be more of a delusion. So in that case, if you want to hear more about this, I talk about it in my books a little bit, but basically I started getting like unnecessary medical procedures done and shit. So it was getting taken to a level that was like really, really getting weird. That was like I said during the presentation itself, that was extremely disturbing and extremely scary. That happened back in like 2018, if I'm remembering correctly. But thank you for your question. That's a great question, and it's important to understand the distinction.
Like when you were on the road trip and like you were kind of by yourself experiencing those symptoms, and at that time did you realize that maybe something was different than before, like you were going through something that was not quite normal, or not necessarily until you got back?
That's such a good question. I'm trying to remember, like, I didn't really start recognizing that my behavior was abnormal until maybe like March or April of that year, because I would be experiencing symptoms of psychosis. And like I remember, so as an example, there was one night I was like sleeping in the living room in my parents' house, and my dad and I were both like crashed out on different couches in the living room, and I just kept hearing voices, and I like stood up and started like yelling into the darkness. And when I did that, I was like, oh wait, dude, this is crazy. Like, what are you doing? But I was still like, I couldn't break myself out of it. But like, it was very, it caused like a lot of cognitive dissonance. It was very strange. So I guess that's just one example of that.
Throughout like your experience, or do you have a take on like medical marijuana and if it's been helpful in your journey, or not, or the opposite?
What's marijuana? Yeah, I love marijuana. Okay, so I'm not a doctor, right? But a lot of doctors frown upon bipolar people using cannabis. In my own personal experience, I use medical marijuana. It's been very helpful for mood stability. You can definitely use it in a way that's detrimental and abusive, but if you can establish a relationship with it where it's going to be balanced and not like dominating your life, then yeah.
Thank you.
But yeah, marijuana's helpful.
So when you like have delusions, are they repeat delusions, or are they different every time?
Yeah. Again, that's going to be something that kind of varies from person to person. So I really had two instances of very significant delusions, and the first was in 2015, which I talked about during the presentation, and then the second was in 2018, which was the psychotic depression. So in terms of like if those delusions were repeating, that remains to be seen. But I always kind of have like a healthy paranoia about the government going on, and so I wouldn't be surprised if that eventually comes back. But like I've said, since being on antipsychotic meds for most of the last like 8 to 9 years, I haven't really had major symptoms with psychosis normally, and I'm very thankful for that.
I know BP typically gets diagnosed in early 20s. So as a child and through adolescence, were there any indications that you might have had, or something through your college experiences that kind of clued you in that something might be different from your childhood, or not really?
Yeah, it's so hard because I think when you're like 18 or 19, you're still learning so much about yourself and your life and your relationship with the world around you. So it's really difficult to narrow it down, but I think something that I did notice when I was like 18 or 19 was like, I think I'm using drugs and alcohol more excessively than people around me. That was like one of the like early signs where I was like, I'm tending to go like pretty hard here. And yeah, so I guess that is one of the things that was foreshadowing it.
I'm sure things have changed, but I feel like in my experience being a psych major, like a lot of the stuff that we learn about like destigmatizes mental illness and treating mental illness and medicating for mental illness. So like how did your experience like being a psych major but then not wanting to be medicated, like how did that work out?
Yeah, I think that like in addition to my college education that I was involved with at that time, my other education was like the Joe Rogan Experience, the podcast, and like on that show, don't get medical advice from Joe Rogan, because like back in like 2011, that's back when they were always talking about how bad antidepressants were, how they change your personality. So I have a lot of personal stigma because of Joe Rogan. All right, I'm joking. Like Joe's fine, but like. Seriously, stuff like that, hearing those sorts of statements really turned me off of the whole thing. I was like, is this going to change my personality and turn me into someone who I'm not? The whole personal identity thing was a big factor in all of that. So, yeah. Great question, thank you.
How did were you hesitant to go see a psychiatrist or?
You know, at the time, it didn't really bother me because I didn't think anything was wrong. So I saw it as an opportunity actually to get access to pharmaceutical narcotics. So I was like, okay, I'll go talk to her and I'll just say I have anxiety and hopefully she'll cut me some good scripts. And instead I went in, but basically I went in and I was just acting so manic that instead she started cutting me prescriptions for lithium, and I was like, this sucks. But I kept going just because I didn't really care. I wasn't taking it seriously at all. I thought I was just really high on life and had just graduated college and was on top of the world having a great time. But objectively, something more problematic was occurring.
So I have a friend who's been diagnosed with BP and who's also struggled with staying on medication and stuff. How do you supporting them? Do you have anything to say the best way to do that with struggling as they're struggling with that?
That's exactly the type of relationships and conversations that we want to see happening so these issues can stop being whispered about, right? So that's phenomenal. I mean, in terms of what you can do to support friends who are newly diagnosed and are very much still navigating the experience, I think honestly, just letting them know that you're there to listen if they want to talk is huge. And you can still establish boundaries and be like, hey, let me know if you want to talk about something heavy and I'll reach back out to you or whatever. You can establish it in that sort of way. But I think knowing that you have the support of your friends and family and community is hugely beneficial for getting to that place of stability, and not feeling like a victim or you have a disability, but rather this is just an aspect of my life that I deal with and I kind of roll with the punches on. But yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I think it really does all begin with listening and communication.
So kind of piggybacking off of that question, were there any times that you felt anybody went the wrong way about it and kind of led you in the wrong direction?
Besides Joe Rogan? I was friends with some real homies back in those days, some really good buddies of mine, and we had a great relationship as homies, but also we weren't really keeping an eye on each other, and so I think there were times where, for example, my friends probably should have been hey dude, take it down a few notches, or even, it's possible that they were like that and I just ignored them and don't remember, but things like that, kind of checking each other as friends, not, you don't have to be a super authoritarian person or anything, but just looking out for each other would have been helpful back then.
Obviously you're open about your mental health, clearly, but do you ever feel apprehensive at all to share your story or feel judged by people, because like I myself am relatively open about it, but there's times like, do I want to post on my Instagram story? Because I feel like people, which is stupid, like you can see it, but like people unfollow me and like stuff like that. And again, like I'm like comfortable with it, but I still feel judged at times and apprehensive. Do you ever feel that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel that all the time. I mean, but you gotta remind yourself, like, don't concern yourself with tiny minds when they get blown. It's like what I tell myself, you know, straight up. Because, like, if people are not able to wrap their heads around this sort of thing, that's okay. We're still here doing what we're doing. So when they want to come around and approach that, whenever they're ready to, it'll be there. And for people who actively want more support and want to learn more about these things, we're there as a resource. So I think that is really important to keep in mind too. In terms of like social media followers and stuff, I hear you, man, because even though it sounds silly, like it's invalidating if you post something and then you lose a bunch of people, you're like, oh, did I do something wrong? And it's like, no, but there will be judgment out there that comes with the territory. I personally don't let it bother me anymore. I'm very confident in what I'm doing. I mean, the fact that you all are here listening to this and people haven't just completely walked out already is like amazing. So thank you. All right. Okay, and there was a question back here too.
We touched like on our normal state class about like civil commitment, and I know you touched on that too. And I can definitely see like how unethical, but like I know you have like personal experience. So I was just curious like what you think about.
Like in terms of like the ethical ramifications?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, so first of all, I think on a very general level, law enforcement shouldn't be included with medical care. If there is a cop detaining you and taking you to a location, in my mind, that is a criminal matter where you should have like an attorney and other things. Now, in a civil commitment hearing, you do have an attorney, but it's an attorney who's given to you at the hospital. They take your cell phone and everything else from you so you can't contact anybody. And then you're basically stuck there with some random court-appointed attorney who may or may not have any experience in mental health law. So from that like starting point, everything continues to go downhill. At least it did in my experience. Psychiatric hospitals are not always safe places. They can be very distressing places. I know some real horror stories about psych hospitals. A lot of them have been discussed on the Bipolar Recorder podcast. There are certain situations where people do have like life-saving, helpful treatment at psych wards, and that's amazing. But unfortunately, I cannot say that I have that experience. But thank you for your question.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for coming out, guys.